You've probably heard the discourse about Yumemizuki Mizuki by now. Some people like her looks as a maid plus Baku fusion, some people hate her looks because it's not modest enough. Some people like her combat for how cute and simple it is, some people hate her combat because they just don't think she's strong enough. Me personally, they could never get me to hate her. I'm not too attached to Mizuki's looks or playstyle, but if there's one thing I will compliment Hoyoverse on, it is their intent when designing this character. Yumemizuki Mizuki is a standard banner Anemo catalyst, and she's clearly designed to be an on-field swirl DPS and healer hybrid that's very beginner and casual friendly. Everything from her kit to Constellations either supports her swirl damage, buffs her off-field teammates, or gives her quality of life to her healing and skills, which is a lot better than older standard characters who either have kits that are all over the place or just flat out suck. As for how Mizuki starts dealing swirl damage, enter her elemental skill. This skill allows her to hover in the air and launch attacks against nearby enemies every 0.75 seconds. These attacks swirl every other hit, so you'll swirl once every 1.5 seconds over the duration of the skill. The initial duration of Mizuki's skill only allows her to float for 5 seconds, but as long as you're triggering swirl twice during her skill, her first ascension talent will double that short duration into a total of 10 seconds for field time. And to top it all off, while Mizuki floats around, the party swirl damage will increase for every point of elemental mastery that she builds. If you go the full elemental mastery route like you would on a Kazuha or Sucrose for example, you can expect each swirl to deal anywhere near 60% more damage compared to if this passive didn't exist. While that's definitely a nice bonus, it's intentionally balanced to still deal worse DPS than your traditional crit-based damage dealers like Neuvillette, Arlecchino, Mavuika, etc. But don't worry. Mizuki's lack of desire for attack or crit supports and her heavy incentive to swirl means that her teams load up on off-field damage dealers to have a more even damage contribution between each character on the team. We'll talk about that more in the team section, but for now let's move on to her elemental burst. Mizuki's burst is where all of her healing comes from. The initial Anemo hit groups enemies, and for 12 seconds afterwards, this mini Baku will follow your character and drop snacks for you to pick up every 1.5 seconds. When you get close to these snacks, they will heal your active character if they're below 70% HP, and if they're above 70% HP, it will deal AoE Anemo damage instead. Nothing too crazy here when it comes to her burst. Just note that the healing specifically scales with Elemental Mastery, her increased swirl damage buff on her skill scales with Elemental Mastery, and her 4th Ascension talent pretty much gives her a free 100 EM buff, so it's pretty clear what her build is going to look like. If you already struggled to build Kazuha and Sucrose, go ahead and add Yumemizuki Mizuki to that list as well, because you have yet another character to farm a full Elemental Mastery Viridescent Venerer artifact set for. The 4-set Viridescent Venerer should be the only artifact set you're building on Mizuki for 3 reasons. 1, it buffs her swirl damage, which is the main source of damage from her kit. 2, it shreds the elemental resistance of any element she swirls, which is a huge buff to her teammates who tend to deal non-negligible damage. And 3, the 4-set Viridescent Venerer's Red Shred can only occur when the wielder is on field, which fits perfectly with Mizuki's playstyle and role within her teams. For artifact stats, as mentioned before, Triple EM is the standard build for Mizuki, but Energy Recharge in the Sands can be viable if you have no ER substat roles or just a team that has poor energy generation. Her skill can generate up to 4 Anemo particles over its duration, so while she does have some energy requirements, they aren't completely unreasonable because she is on field most of the time. Depending on her teammates, I suggest anywhere between 140 to 160% energy recharge to be able to burst every rotation. Luckily, aside from Elemental Mastery, Substat Focus is literally just energy recharge. That means once you get your hands on Elemental Mastery main stat pieces, she's not very picky with what comes afterwards. Weapons are definitely the more complicated part about Mizuki's build relative to her artifacts, but that's not saying much given how simple her artifact build is. Now, is her signature catalyst Sunny Morning Sleep-In her best in slot option? Technically, yes. Is this weapon a must pull? Absolutely not. Literally, all this weapon does is give up to 513 Elemental Mastery. No team buffs, no personal energy generation, just a ton of EM. And to most players, that small buff to her damage and healing from extra Elemental Mastery just simply isn't worth the hefty Primogem cost that comes with pulling on weapon banners. There are a ton of other weapons that also give Elemental Mastery like 1000 Floating Dreams, Starcaller's Watch, Sacrificial Fragments, and Wandering Evenstar that all work wonderfully on Mizuki if you already have them. For non-elemental mastery catalysts, Favonius Codex is your go-to support option for better team energy generation. Out of those 5 options mentioned, the one I want to talk about in depth is the Sacrificial Fragments. The neat thing about this weapon's passive is that it can reset the wielder's skill cooldown, and this works with Mizuki's skill, which starts its cooldown timer when she starts hovering, not when her skill ends. So what you can do is you can get through about half of Mizuki's skill duration, cancel her skill, and immediately use her skill again to continue hovering. This does 2 things. First, it allows Mizuki to generate 4 extra Anemo energy particles because her particle generation is capped out at 4 particles per skill use. Second, it allows Mizuki to have a fuel time that's longer than 10 seconds. The latter point is super useful because a team with a 20-second rotation, for example, would only use about 5 to 6 seconds setting up supports, and having Sacrificial Fragments allows Mizuki to properly play on field for the full 14 to 15 seconds remaining in the rotation. Most teams will not support the full 20 seconds of Mizuki's hovering with her skill cooldown reset, so that's why we cancel her first skill use early. While Mizuki is a very simple and comfortable standard banner character to use gameplay-wise, her biggest flaw is her pickiness for teammates. If you're looking to buff her damage, EM supports are very hard to find, and even with prominent meta picks like Sucrose and Nahida, they aren't perfect with Mizuki either. Running a double Anemo setup with Sucrose is a bit redundant and usually less than ideal. Running Nahida does give Mizuki up to 250 extra EM, but Nahida's strong Dendro application can prevent Mizuki from reliably getting swirls unless you're running double Electro characters for the final 2 slots. Some players might think, okay, what's the big deal? Mizuki doesn't deal an absurd amount of damage herself, so let's just load the team with a ton of off-field damage dealers instead. And while I agree with that sentiment and that's what we're going to do, that's also where you'll feel the consequences of her pickiness for teammates. You see, when Mizuki uses her skill, she kinda just floats around. You can't normal attack or charge attack, meaning she loses multiple synergies with off-field damage dealers like Xingqiu, Yelan, Beidou, etc. While that's disappointing, let's not dwell on the negatives for too long. One of Yumemizuki Mizuki's synergies is with Furina, who is both an extremely popular character and a top meta pick for both buffing and off-field DPS. Although Furina's HP drain forces Mizuki under 70% HP and she may lose 2 or 3 swirls during her burst whenever she heals back up, a slight drop to Mizuki's damage is not really a big deal compared to the positives. Between the two, they still provide consistent red shred from the 4-set Viridescent with Mizuki's on-field playstyle, and a huge damage percent buff for all of the off-field damage dealers with Furina's burst. The most popular archetype to play with the Mizuki and Furina pairing is an Electrocharge team, often called Taser teams. Your standard setup is going to be Mizuki, Furina, Orodon, and Fischl. Orodon provides the 4-set scroll of the hero of Cinder City to buff Electro and Hydro damage, while Fischl is just a great generalist unit with good single target damage and high energy generation. Replacements for Orodon or Fischl include any off-field Electro character that doesn't require Mizuki to normal attack, so that leaves you with Lisa or Yaemiko. Players lacking the Electro options or players that simply do not want to run a Taser team can also look to replace one Electro character with an off-field Pyro character. Because both the Hydro and Electro auras can briefly exist on an enemy suffering from Electrocharge, adding a Pyro character can result in both Overload and Vaporize reactions simultaneously. Your options for off-field Pyro application include Xiangling, Mavuika, Deha, and Pyro Traveler. The other prominent archetype to run with Mizuki is Aggravate. This is because Electro Swirls can proc Aggravate, and because both reactions benefit from building EM, Mizuki gets great value out of her aggravated Electro Swirls. Aggravate's setup is very similar to Taser teams where we want double Electro characters for teammates. The Dendro applicator in the final slot will usually avoid defensive options like Baizhu and Yao Yao and instead favor purely offensive units with Nahida, Dendro MC, or Kole because Mizuki already provides enough healing by herself. Double Electro is absolutely important, especially with Nahida's strong Dendro application, because we want to guarantee that enemies will be affected by Electro so that Mizuki actually has an element to swirl. And before we end the video, let's quickly cover Mizuki's Constellations since she is a standard banner character and many players will very well end up with multiple Constellations on her. C1 essentially gives her a big swirl 3 different times during her elemental skill that deals about double the damage of a normal swirl. While I'm sure we all appreciate the slight damage increase, this constellation is nothing compared to her C2 and C4. C2 is pretty much a copy and paste of Kazuha's elemental damage buff whenever she floats around during her skill. The number scaling is exactly the same as Kazuha, meaning a 1000 EM Mizuki can grant the party 40% elemental damage bonus for Pyro, Cryo, Hydro, and Electro characters. This is for sure one of her best constellations. The only other constellation that can challenge it is C4, which allows her snacks from her elemental burst to both heal and damage at the same time, which is a huge quality of life change to her kit. Again, this is another copy and pasted effect, but this time from Sayu C1, which also happens to be one of Sayu's best constellations. And lastly, Mizuki C6 grants her swirls a fixed 30% crit rate and 100% crit damage, which results in a 30% personal damage increase on average when you don't include any non-swirl damage. In terms of overall team DPS, it's probably around a 6 to 10% team DPS increase since Mizuki's damage isn't anything great to begin with. I view this in the same realm as Mizuki C1, where it's a nice to have type of constellation but far from necessary despite it being her final constellation. But with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this Yumemizuki Mizuki guide, and most importantly, I hope this guide was helpful for building the perfect Mizuki for your account. Other than that, it's the same as always. I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.